All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. I would ask you to keep your microphones muted. If you're not on Q&A, you should be muted when you came onto the call, so we just ask you to keep it muted throughout the duration of the call. My name is Tabitha Fritz. I'm a cannabis education consultant, and I'm also the CEO of Fritz's Cannabis Company. We make infused gummies and other cannabis products. So I'm especially excited about this panel today because I think it will be very interesting, both for myself personally, but for the industry that I work in. I'm also a board member of the Canadian Business History Association, who is putting on this talk today. Now, the Canadian Business History Association works to preserve and present Canadian business history, both domestically and globally around the world. So we really think that business history is important, and with particular regards to Canada, and that's what we work to promote and preserve. I joined the board this year because personally, I think that history is very important. I got my MBA at the University of Toronto, and one of my professors there was named Chris Kobrak. And he was actually one of the reasons that we started the Canadian Business History Association. But he used to say this Mark Twain quote in class, and he would say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that always really spoke to me because I think that once we start to really recognize the patterns of the past, they can really inform our present and help us prepare for potential future trajectories. So I think it's incredibly important, both as a business person and as someone who's just interested in helping to make the world a better place, that we are able to learn from the past and learn what has happened so that we can put forward the future that we really want to see in the world. So today is the third panel in our speaker series, which has been sponsored by National Bank. We're very grateful to National Bank for sponsoring this series. And today's topic is coffee, cannabis, and alcohol, from stigmatized to normalized. Now, we'll be looking at each of these topics individually. And we have a group of experts here who are here with us today to speak about each of these topics. And we're really hoping to have some time for Q&A at the end of this call. So some people have already emailed me questions that they have. Thank you so much for that. And if you have questions for our panelists during the talk, please just put them in the chat. I will look for them, and then we will be able to ask our panelists your questions. I'm sure a lot of interesting things will come up for you today, so please don't hesitate to let us know if you have questions that you would like answered. And now, with no further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. We'll start first with Craig Heron. So Craig is Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at York University. He's the author of numerous articles and books on Canadian social history, including Booze, A Distilled History from 2003. He has been chair of the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre, vice chair of the Ontario Heritage Foundation, and president of the Canadian Historical Association, and is currently president of the Toronto Workers' History Project. Thanks so much for joining us today, Craig. We also have Jeronimo de Miguel. Now, Jeronimo is a brand strategist. In 2018, he co-founded the Open Collective in Prince Edward County to help individuals explore the potential of human achievement through mindful, expansive programming in a single connected natural environment. He's currently partner and chief strategist at global consulting practice Sunday+Night and managing partner of Gusto Green, a global cannabis lifestyle brand that reimagines the future of food and adaptogens with initial operations in downtown LA opening March 2021. Thanks for being here, Jeronimo. And finally, we have Professor Jonathan Morris from the University of Hertfordshire, which I did look up on YouTube to learn how to pronounce before this call today. So I hope I did it all right. Jonathan is a historian of consumption with particular interests in commodities, food, marketing, retailing, and the processes of transnational transfer. His specialist area is the history of coffee. And so we are going to start with Professor Morris today, and he's going to give us an introduction to his work and tell us a little bit about the history of coffee. Professor Morris? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
There we go.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much, and I'm really excited to participate in this workshop. I guess what I wanted to do with the history of coffee is just sort of outline some of the ways that I see it interacting with other psychoactive drugs and the way that it has acquired or has fought to acquire a market. And to do that, as Tabitha says, I'm going to do my naked plug and say, yes, I am a historian of coffee, and I'm going to kind of summarize my entire book in about 3 seconds. Coffee, really, the first origins of coffee as we see it enter into the marketplace are actually as a functional substitute for a psychoactive stimulant. Because coffee, as we first know it, as we first see it being traded, is used as a substitute for the stimulant known as cat, the kind of thing that you chew, a herb that you chew. In around the 1450s, the Sufi sects in Yemen, so Muslim sects, used a beverage or used to chew cat, use a beverage made from cat in order to keep them in a state of euphoria as they perform their kind of nighttime devotions, what they call daikas, so these long ceremonies. However, around that time, there was a shortage of cat in Yemen. And one of the sort of Yemeni, one of the Sufi leaders suggested that actually they could make a substitute. And if they used this plant coffee, which he had seen growing in Ethiopia and being used in Ethiopia, this would be an alternative source of energy that could keep people awake during the night to perform their religious ceremonies and keep them going into the following day. So coffee first sort of appears as a traded good to fulfill this particular demand to create a beverage that's known at that time as quiche. So the first sort of big challenge that coffee faces thereafter is from essentially the forces of religion. We know that in Mecca in 1511, the local governor, a man called Khair Beg, got coffee banned by the local Islamic courts. He wanted a ruling that it was effectively illicit for good Muslims to consume coffee. And what he did was get a set of physicians who testified that coffee itself was an intoxicant. And Muslims are, of course, not allowed to consume intoxicants. So his argument was effectively that coffee was an intoxicant, just like alcohol, and it promotes loss of control over the body. Pleasingly, that judgment was relatively rapidly overturned on the basis that, of course, coffee is a stimulant rather than an intoxicant. There's a later verse that talks about you don't, when you drink coffee, you don't sort of fall asleep, but you actually have the word of the Lord on your lips. You're energized by it. The second attempt to challenge coffee came on the basis that when coffee is roasted, that it rendered it an inanimate substance. And again, Muslims are not allowed to consume inanimate substances for food and drink. That was definitively overruled in the 1590s on the basis that coffee roasting doesn't completely carbonize the coffee bean, so that coffee bean remained in a vegetable state. So what we're seeing here, I think, straight away is some interesting things happening. Basically, we're seeing the use of attempts to use religion and religious imperatives as actually a way to do something else, to prevent the consumption of coffee because the consumption of coffee was seen as problematic. But I suspect that the reason it's seen as problematic is actually far more to do with where it's consumed than what it actually does for you. Coffee houses are the first public space that, as it were, reputable Muslim men could meet outside the mosque. If coffee is licit to drink, then coffee houses are licit places to gather. And if coffee houses are licit places to gather, then there is the problem that people might go there and say things against the government or against the authorities, or in some way do something that challenges the ruling order. So, for example, well into the 17th century, the sultans of the Ottoman Empire would often try and close coffee houses on the pretext that they posed a risk to public safety public morality. Interestingly, they connected that not just to the consumption of coffee, but also to the consumption of tobacco on the premises. Tobacco, again, you know, a kind of a drug, a stimulant, and argued that this created a potential fire risk. Again, the reality seems very different, that this is much more to do with sedition, getting rid of sedition, promoting almost despotic rule. There's a Sultan, Murad IV, who put out a decree which said, if I find anyone opening a coffee house, I decree that they must be strung up over its rafters, in other words, hung from the rafters outside their shop. So you might think coffee had a bit of a big challenge then. And in theory, you'd be right, it probably disappears from Istanbul for a while, but even within the Ottoman Empire, most people continue drinking coffee, because the power of coffee is that the very people who were required to enforce this law were also the patrons of coffee houses, and quite often had invested in coffee houses, used coffee houses for socialization, and were inclined to basically turn a blind eye to the coffee house. Coffee's later entry into Europe, again, is quite interesting to view in a sort of a relationship really with another drug, alcohol. Coffee is presented as it comes in as a beverage that, in contrast to alcohol, again, you know, promotes wakefulness, promotes mental activity, as opposed to actually promoting drowsiness. And of course, the great advantage of that is that in a continent where this alcohol was being consumed not just socially, but as sort of small beer to basically keep people hydrated, then by contrast, coffee would make you fitter for doing business, for being active, for working, for mental alertness. And coffee houses developed, first of all, in Europe, in London in the 1650s, very much functioning as places that merchants, businessmen would gather to exchange information, to exchange trades. We all know the stories that, you know, that London Stock Exchange emerged out of a coffee house. The shipping exchange, famously Lloyd's, emerged out of Lloyd's coffee house. Again, plenty of evidence of activity of opposition to those to these developments, promoted by other interests. Some of them quite amusing. So there's the famous women's petition against coffee. The women's petition against coffee maintains, in effect, that coffee makes men less able to perform. So instead of having brewer's droop, men get coffee droop, which seems one that would be rather difficult to sustain at any particular point. So we suspect that quite possibly, rather than women making this complaint, this might have been a complaint fomented, as it were, by the landlords and proprietors of traditional taverns. An interesting element, again, in the whole spread of coffee at this point is that this is about an issue about who controls, who is allowed to sell coffee, and to whom does that defer under the kind of the guild systems that are still to various extents in operation. So, for example, in Italy, you might wonder why Italy doesn't have coffee houses before London, and the reason is because coffee is sold by apothecaries in Italy. It's sold as a medicinal drug. In Paris, cafes only emerge once it's been decreed that, in fact, distillers are to be given a license to sell coffee to be served seated at a table. There's this big distinction between who can serve it, who can sell it. Distillers are allowed to sell it, hence the cafe emerges as this kind of combined place in which people take coffee and take alcohol, but take very specifically distilled alcohol. And again, of course, we get that sort of classic sort of French combination of the cafe becoming a place in which we have alcohol, coffee, and tobacco, again, the big three drugs. The medical claims made in Europe around coffee were obviously, as you can already tell from the women's petition, somewhat unbounded by knowledge or fact. So, for example, on the other hand, the promoters of the early coffee houses in London would maintain that it cured everything from stone, dropsy, wind, and it also promoted the famous white complexion of the Turks. that one of them ended, which again seems to rest rather heavily on people not actually knowing anyone from Turkey. The impact of caffeine as a psychoactive drug was embraced. And it was embraced, I guess, above all in two ways. One, as a, if you like, the sort of the classic thing that we all know about artists embracing caffeine as a kind of way of releasing their muse. I think Voltaire and Balzac are supposed to have drunk about 50 cups of coffee a day, which seems highly improbable even with little demi-tasses, but is very much part of the myth of coffee as a functional thing. The other thing, right at the other end of the scale, that coffee does in some areas of Europe, and the reason that coffee begins to break out of purely elite consumption, is that it's used by some workers to maintain their levels of output while working. So, for example, weavers in the Low Countries doing piecework who can't afford to actually stop, break their work, will take coffee. It's warming, it's stimulating, it keeps them going. It can be perhaps sort of consumed almost if it has sort of, you know, additions of sugar or whatever, as a fuel that obviates the need to actually cease output. And one other important psychoactive effect of coffee is that coffee also has great value during war. During the US Civil War, the consumption rates for coffee on both, well, the consumption rate for coffee on the Union side is very, very high. And it's quite clear that it's being used in a way by generals as both a comfort food and a stimulus to keep people fighting through the day, to give them that kind of sort of warmth and well-being feeling. If we look famously, if you look at memoirs of ordinary soldiers in the Civil War from the Union side, they often use the word coffee more frequently than they use the word rifle, bullet, etc. It gives you some sense of the importance of this. And similarly in Europe, in the First World War, I'd say that the First World War was one of the ways, again, in which coffee was really popularized amongst the lowest classes, those who were conscripted into the soldiery. If you look at Italian consumption of coffee, for example, it rises very significantly during that First World War era because it's being issued to the troops. But the greater understanding of caffeine and its effects also leads to a lot of negative campaigning against coffee in the 20th century. Not only the development of decaf as a you know, a kind of a product in itself, sort of a decaffeinated coffee, but other caffeine-free alternatives. Probably the most well-known is what's called postum, this roasted grain product produced by the Post Company from sort of the first half of the 20th century in particular, that actually is very, very aggressively marketed as avoiding all the kind of problems that coffee creates for you, very strongly positioned as, you know, caffeine must be bad for you, it must upset your stomach, this is good for you. And that really is a contest that we see continue in one form or another across the 20th century, in which actually coffee is probably for most of it losing, culminating in caffeine actually being indicated as carcinogenic, increasingly accepted in the medical literature as carcinogenic, as a carcinogenic substance, making the advertising and promotion of coffee quite difficult. What do you actually focus on? We talk a lot less about its psychoactive effects now if you look at the advertising. But what we still don't talk about in advertising, and what I'll leave you with, is that in fact, right now there's a lot of medical positive stories about coffee. Justin, I think this might echo some of the things that Tabitha and Jeronimo will be interested in the sense that no one in coffee yet is prepared to actually go out and pitch that this is a product that you could consume that should give you beneficial protection against Alzheimer's, can give you beneficial protection against bowel cancer, has a whole range now of positive medical outcomes associated with it. But because of this overwhelming concentration on the psychoactive functions of caffeine, we tend to avoid or tend not to see these being used in a commercial way. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I'm really interested to just hear what Craig and Jeronimo have to say. But hopefully that gives you some sort of thoughts for how we could think about psychoactive substances over the centuries.
That was great. Thank you. That was so interesting. One thing that you said that really spoke to me was who's allowed to sell it and who's allowed to serve it. Two things that I think will continue to come up as we think about these other substances. So with that, let's switch over to Craig. So Craig, could you please tell us a bit about the history of alcohol?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I would want to start with is that we're talking about a story of normal to stigmatized to renormalized, in the sense that at least 5,000 years ago, people were drinking alcohol, and we don't know how much further back perhaps, but it was part of daily life for many, many people of all ages, as well as a lubricant of a lot of social and ritualized occasions, a social bonding, especially amongst men. Taverns became a very central community gathering place for those kinds of social activities and ritualized activities where men consumed alcohol together. And I think in some ways the fact that it was so deeply embedded in daily life makes it somewhat different from cannabis, which we're going to make comparisons with, I'm sure. But only very, very recently can we say that cannabis was a part of a large number of people's daily lives. But still, you don't give an 8-year-old a bit of cannabis so they get used to the taste of it the way you would have given them some red wine centuries ago. For the most part, alcohol was produced locally, but in the age of European colonization and settlement, distilled spirits became part of international trade, especially brandy and rum, and they became part of trading practices with indigenous peoples in more than one part of the world, particularly here in Canada. And yet alcohol was never treated as just a drink like any other, and it's partly because of the impact of alcohol on the body. Partly that. Drunkenness was always seen as a problem, with its impact on public order and on domestic life. But also there was a concern with alcohol's impact on public order in the places in which it was consumed, in public drinking places, taverns, where not only could there be violence and disorder, but there could be, as in the case of coffee houses, subversive activities going on, and there often were. It was a gathering place for lots of discussion. The counterbalance, of course, was that alcohol was a major source of revenue for many governments, so they never wanted to get rid of it. No one ever talked about banning it before the 19th century. They might have talked about other forms of regulation of it, but before the early 19th century, most regulation was directed at public drinking places, taverns in particular, where you'd have to pay for a license, you'd have to pay taxes and so on. And that flowed into public revenues and into concerns about policing. But at that point, the early 19th century, in this part of the world in particular, consumption of alcohol was coming under closer scrutiny from cultural and moral perspectives, from particularly the middling classes. It was often rejected as antithetical to an age of progress and to capitalist development. Drunken men are not good farmers, they're not good workers, they're not good craftsmen. The strongest critique came from evangelical Protestantism, but here in Canada and Quebec, the Catholic Church also led a major temperance campaign in the 1830s and 40s that drew in thousands of people. By the middle of the 19th century, campaigns to get people to take the pledge to put down the bottle were transitioning to efforts to get legislation to ban the production and sales of alcoholic beverages, prohibition, as we've come to call it. At this point, the Catholics and the non-evangelical Protestants parted company, since they didn't believe in state intervention to impose personal morality. But the impact of evangelical Protestantism on Canadian culture and on North American culture in general, and on certain Northern European cultures, was powerful enough that it was on the political agenda for generations afterwards. Most governments tried to avoid direct responsibility for suppressing alcohol consumption by holding referenda, because they knew how unpopular and divisive an issue it was, holding referenda rather than passing legislation. But those campaigns had mixed success until the First World War, when arguments about national efficiency in the time of war convinced governments across North America to ban booze. In the United States, it was a national measure, but in Canada, it was the provinces that introduced and then repealed prohibition. So there was a lot of unevenness across this country. Also, in the United States, the shutdown of manufacturing and retail sales was complete. But in Canada, in a funny constitutional split, the federal government had responsibility for the production of alcohol as well as interprovincial and international trade, whereas the provinces had control over retail sales. So the federal government decided that there was a export market that needed to be protected, which of course was a farce in most ways, because the beer that we produced really didn't get sold overseas. Some of our spirits did. But nonetheless, that meant that production continued alongside the shutdown of all of the saloons and liquor stores. That created conditions for widespread rum running and bootlegging as thousands of Canadians continued to drink. And it was enabled by the producers who quietly were participating in that process and selling their alcohol to the bootleggers and rum runners. There were blind pigs operating in most neighborhoods across the country, supplied by extensive networks of bootleggers, and the cops often turned a blind eye. This was probably, I've argued, the most widespread form of civil disobedience in Canadian history, just literally tens of thousands of people ignoring the law, trying to get around it. Prohibition was rolled back province by province, mostly in the 1920s, for three related reasons. First, many members of the upper classes wanted to be able to restock their wine cellars, and so threw themselves into campaigns for repeal. If you look at the leaders of the campaigns, they're frequently the most prestigious members of the local society. Secondly, enforcement of prohibition laws tended to be farcical, as I've already suggested, and many social and political leaders worried about the long-term threat to the rule of law. This was not a good thing, they thought. It was going on for most of a decade in some parts of the country. And thirdly, politicians wanted to get back the strong revenue stream that taxing booze had produced. And so many provincial politicians made that a key part of their argument, that their budgets needed that money back again. So the new regulatory framework that emerged after Prohibition, largely by the 1930s, I'm leaving aside the Maritimes where it was a bit slower. Prince Edward Island had Prohibition from 1901 to 1949. Go into that in more detail later, but if people are interested. But anyway, the new regulatory framework was called government control and included sales of alcohol through government liquor stores and tight control of public drinking places, which were mostly only beer parlors initially, and only later in the 1940s and 50s did they start to license cocktail lounges. There was still a strong element of control over drinkers that the name Liquor Control Board conveys. Drinkers in most provinces required a license to be able to buy booze in a government liquor store, and inside beer parlors, their behavior was tightly controlled during hours of operation. Hours of operation were tightly restricted. Outside of Quebec, I should just pause for a second. When I say tightly controlled behavior, they were not allowed to stand up and move around. They were not allowed to eat. They were not allowed to have music. They're not allowed to sing. They were not allowed to play cards or have any other entertainment. Have your beer and go home. That was the attitude of these beer parlors for about 30 years. And hours of operation were tightly restricted. Outside of Quebec, advertising of alcohol was forbidden. So as a result of all these continuing restrictions, bootlegging continued on in the shadows. So if the liquor store and the bars were closed, you would find some local booze can to get your booze. That regime survived more or less until the 1970s, when government controls on the sale of alcohol eased substantially, with lower drinking ages, fancier self-serve liquor stores, and much more relaxed tavern cultures with food and entertainment and longer hours of operation. Governments were responding to widespread demands for more freedom and personal responsibility that ranged from student power to sexual liberation. Alcohol consumption became respectable again, despite the marginal criticisms that were made of it from different quarters. If you want, we can talk about Mothers Against Drug Driving as a sort of new current of temperance activity, but it was really quite marginal compared to the kinds of temperance prohibition movements that had existed a century earlier. Except, of course, I should say it became more respectable. Canada was attracting larger numbers of immigrants who were coming from cultures where alcohol really wasn't consumed, particularly Islamic countries. And so the percentage of the population that were abstainers was actually substantial, and consumption seemed to be overall to be lower. By this point, too, concerns about excessive drinking had flowed into more intense alcohol and drug addiction studies in places like Ontario's Addiction Research Foundation, and also into the rapidly expanding network of self-help known as Alcoholics Anonymous. Both of those organizations abandoned the old notion of alcohol itself as the problem and now focused on alcoholism as a disease that specific persons were susceptible to, and therefore you targeted them. I was going to add something that Jonathan, in relation to what Jonathan mentioned, has gone out of my head, but I'll come back to it, I'm sure. The liberalization of alcohol consumption by no means ended the close monitoring of these beverages by governments, or their willingness to fill up government treasuries with taxes and levies raised from them. The Ontario government gets more than $2 billion a year from the LCBO. So when they talk about downsizing, privatizing, whatever, they're talking about giving up that revenue. And over the past quarter century, more and more alcohol sales have moved into private hands in Canada, so that we have a mixed system of distribution that has seemed to shaped considerably, or at least influenced, how cannabis would be regulated. And that's the transition, the segue we can have to Jeronimo's contribution.
Wonderful, thank you, Craig. I didn't know, for instance, that the beer parlors were so not fun, that you weren't allowed to have any fun. That's very interesting. I did not know that. And yes, that's a perfect segue. So Jeronimo, let's talk about cannabis, right? And consumption lounges, especially something that you're very interested in. And maybe there's something from alcohol we can learn from that.
For sure. It's fascinating to me to hear you both speak about, alcohol and coffee. I think we do need, next time we should probably invite somebody to speak about tobacco as well. I can see that being an interesting add-on piece. But, as far as the history is concerned, there's so much to share. And all I'll say is that this dates back to thousands of years, right? Like cannabis as a plant, back to Central Asia in 3000 BC, the Assyrians, there's so much there that I think one could dig into. It arrives in Europe more or less at the level that it's spoken about in the 1930s or so, 1830s, sorry, about 200 years ago. And it's really in the context of distractions at the time from the perspective of what was going on in the heads of those that were experimenting with cannabis as a way to step into what they had witnessed elsewhere in the world. Obviously, a lot of it, like psychedelics, has roots in the context of ritual, if you will, ritualistic engagements at the indigenous level, tobacco as well. But what I find most fascinating is to sort of think about the last 100 years of cannabis and where we are today versus where we were 100 years ago. So, 100 years ago, we were basically in the process of criminalization. If you think about the Canadian context, the Act of 1923, that Opium and Narcotics Drug Act that basically criminalizes cannabis. Around the 1930s as well, the film from a popular culture perspective, Reefer Madness, I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's quite comical. Tabitha, you might have seen it. It's unbelievable, really, what this film portrays and what it says from a popular culture perspective. Very much government propaganda associated with what cannabis can do to the minds of those that consume it, and how it can, drive you crazy, especially with women. I mean, it's quite noticeable to sort of see how government at that level is sort of putting out a message that makes a distinction between the two genders. Beyond that, what I think I'd like to focus on, and because the topic of conversation today is this idea, which I love, the fact that we have moved from normalization to stigmatization and then back to renormalization. And so for me, what's interesting is to sort of think about the obstacles, today and in the last few years towards the renormalization process, if you will. One of them being political, obviously regulatory, and what happened with criminalization. The fact that it was in the US, in particular in the 1970s, cannabis dubbed as a Schedule I substance alongside heroin. and that's a legacy, and obviously something that many states outside of the usual suspects of California and Oregon and so on are still dealing with. From a political and from a societal, I should say, an individual perspective, when we think about stigma, the topic that I think is most interesting as a marketer, as a brand builder for me, is to sort of see what advertising has done for cannabis and what it should be doing going forward. And the same thing, I'm sure, with coffee, as Jonathan mentioned, and alcohol and tobacco. And that to me is fascinating, the role of advertising and brand building, or essentially communication when it comes to these substances. And so we do see that. We see a significant role that advertising plays. Items like Reefer Madness, in the 1930s, all kinds of ads that are taking all kinds of editorial content that is shared, around that time and into the 70s and so on, to sort of position cannabis as a negative, ultimately a contributor to society, or the societal order, as we've referenced before with alcohol and coffee. And then there's the science piece I find really interesting, given how much we are now trying to play catch up in that space, right? Like, so with scientific research, not only was it mostly discontinued because there was just no funding anywhere, given that it had been criminalized, there was scientific research at the time that was taking place that was discontinued, as is the case with psychedelics. And we hear that when we talk about what's been going on recently with psilocybin and the efforts at Johns Hopkins University with MAPS and so on. But beyond that, what was really interesting to me was to sort of look at where the research did go in the last little while, is towards this race to increase THC levels. THC levels in the 1960s, when it came to cannabis, were recorded to be around 4 to 7%, and now we're upwards of 12 to 29%. I mean, when you enter a retail experience, both in Canada and the US, since decriminalization or legalization in some cases, you very much have a conversation about THC levels. Budtenders, or those that are in theory there to inform and educate, are talking about THC levels mostly. And so that to me is the biggest opportunity. It is almost you could see it as a challenge, and I'm sure we can look at coffee and alcohol and learn a lot from those industries in terms of what can be done, tobacco as well. But I think the opportunity for us from a scientific perspective is very much around this idea of shifting from a recreational standpoint, which is very much driven by or obsessed with THC levels, to more of a sort of a wellness play. And I don't want to say medical by design, simply because there's a significant part of the history of cannabis that, as you all know, has to do with medical use, and the fact that, as far as medical use is concerned, sort of paved the way for where we are today with the industry, and that deserves a lot of credit. But I think the real opportunity going forward, if you look at the history of where we've been, has more to do with what cannabis can do from an overarching wellness perspective. So anyways, I wanted to just sort of focus on those 4 elements of the obstacles that we face, partly because of the 3 topics at hand today. Cannabis is sort of the one that has arrived most recently, if you will, to this idea of moving from stigma to normalization. But I find it just fascinating, and I can't wait to have a conversation about the parallels, usage and obstacles and revenue generation and legalization driven by those types of objectives at the government level. Even the conversation around productivity, I think, is fascinating to me, both at the coffee and at the alcohol level. Full disclosure, I come from a family of winemakers. That's how we ended up in Canada from Argentina. So I'm both curious, but also very biased when it comes to alcohol, and particularly wine, as not being the sort of evil that it was painted to be. And having grown up in that culture, a different culture than the Canadian culture that deals with the legacy of prohibition, I'm blown away sometimes by what we encounter, even years after, alcohol ends up being a lot more accepted or accessible.
Thanks, Geronimo. And yeah, I think we do draw so many parallels often between cannabis and alcohol because the trajectory has been so similar recently in our country, right? We've had this prohibition and then moved into this normalization and regulation. But something that you said really interested me, and you spoke about the science research and understanding the health effects of cannabis, which is something that, we know researchers are trying to do right now. But Jonathan, that was something that you spoke about with coffee as well. How is it that researchers have recently identified these beneficial health effects of coffee that they haven't known about before? I'm just wondering if you can talk about that a little.
Yeah, so to do the plug, coffee has something like 800 to 1,000 elements to it. So the concentration has always been on caffeine as that psychoactive element. But actually, there are many other things in coffee which we really don't know that much about. So what we've begun to see is the kind of research that does some more effective research in terms of, well, let's look at the associations between coffee and particularly some forms of particularly sort of aging, actually. So protecting the brain against some aging issues and against some of those other medical issues, usually done by, I suppose, now a much more data-driven approach using kind of lifestyle surveys and so forth. A lot of the early coffee science, in inverted commas, was actually very difficult because it really relies a lot on people's recording of what they've consumed and their understanding of that. And it relied on scientists who, by and large, and I say this with the humbleness of someone who also doesn't understand it very much, but who didn't really understand, I think, the complexity of coffee as a beverage, the complexity of coffee as coffee liqueur, and were really very much focused on this one thing of caffeine. So it's been a more recent effect, I think, from those perspectives. And as I say, the issue about that is we now have quite a lot of that science out there, which certainly would match, for example, some of what Geronimo referred to as the well-being aspects, for example. And the problem is how to translate that. We know that, we actually see it covered. You'll probably have seen it in your own paper, your newspapers or on TV. Every so often somebody produces a study that says, this cancer, so I mean bowel cancer, breast cancer, etc. They're all indications that moderate coffee consumption may help or may be, let's say, positively associated with those, with positive outcomes there. So I think it's really been that we are having a more educated now, a better understanding of the complexity of coffee, and perhaps a bit less desire to focus simply on that one outstanding issue of caffeine. I mean, caffeine itself is very complex, but we know that it is a stimulant. There is no way of saying that it's not a stimulant, but there is so much more going on in terms of the other things that are there.
Yeah, so a lot of the benefit. Yes, please go ahead.
This is what I forgot that I was going to say when I was talking earlier. At least 30 years ago, the same sorts of arguments began to appear about ethanol, or initially about red wine, but more and more about any drug with ethanol in it, that it has health benefits. What has not happened is that the public health authorities have not taken that on board, because in this part of the world, the alcohol studies concerned about the dangers of alcohol are so predominant that they simply aren't prepared to recognize that. But regularly, there's studies produced that show that a regular couple of glasses of red wine a day will help heart condition and all sorts of things. And it's very similar to the other two cases in that sense. It's just that I think that, as Jonathan has just said, it's in the case of coffee, it's emerging into a kind of clarity, but I think it's still fogged terribly in the alcohol area, because quite literally public health authorities won't ever say that alcohol is good for you. It's just not going to. No, doctors will even be cautious about saying that. Although I remember my grandmother being told to drink some sherry when she was a lifelong teetotaler. She was told to drink sherry.
Yeah, the only thing, so I was just going to add, Tabitha, there, that what I find interesting on that front is that you do have a very strong lobbying element in the Canadian context or the US context associated with the perils of overconsumption. We don't see that necessarily with coffee. We actually don't even, we see it a little bit with cannabis, but cannabis' biggest obstacle is likely popular stigma around it, and government wants it to be, I mean, for revenue generating reasons, wants it to be pervasive in some ways. And with alcohol, I think it's what's unique about it is this very well organized and significant lobbying effort that happens when it comes to the issues associated with overconsumption and what, you know, MAD, you mentioned MAD earlier, and that certainly, I think, continues to pose a bit of a challenge to get to that place where we can actually be able to recognize and embrace some of the health benefits of consumption and not overconsumption.
If I can say, Tabitha, I think that's quite an interesting point to discuss in terms of that. I think for coffee, and I would imagine also for alcohol, one of the problems is that people are focused on this notion of addiction.
Yes.
So, you know, the difference between moderate consumption and addiction is positioned as actually addiction sort of, you know, somehow flows out of consumption, rather than recognizing that most people can control consumption. And I'm guessing that has similar issues for cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I would think so, right? It's a matter of, I think, society recognizing that there is, you know, there's a way to balance these things, right? It doesn't have to just be addiction, or it doesn't just have to be a health benefit. That I think that there can be a balance between, you know, something Jeronimo spoke about was wellness, right? You can use each of these substances to improve your overall wellness, right? It doesn't have to be a medicine or, you know, just a vice that we go to. I just saw a question come in from the audience. Great. So Patrice Dutil has a question for you. So let me pose it to the three of you. It looks like legislators across Canada are increasingly considering decriminalization of a vast range of controlled substances. What does history tell us about the arc of regulation? Does history give us lessons about what to do and what not to do? So that's a great question, right? We're talking about decriminalizing all kinds of different things, psychedelics, different kinds of substances. And me too, also my opinion too. So I'll let the experts speak and then I'll tell you what I think. Craig, do you want to go first? You're not muted, so that you're in the hot seat.
Okay. Well, the most obvious thing to say is that tight control didn't work of the substance that I knew most about. In fact, it had quite deleterious effects. Even the more controlled version after Prohibition really didn't work. It made it. I mean, for example, restricted hours of drinking in public places simply meant people went in and binge drank so they could get all of their drinking done in a shorter period of time. Like, that doesn't encourage healthy consumption of alcohol. The liberalization certainly did help. And I think the issue really is public knowledge, as we were just talking about a moment ago. Public knowledge about the substance really needs to be broader and better based in science and less on moral and cultural concerns, I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So I was just going to comment, just add to that, again, going back to the science, but more from the perspective of innovation. I think that there is a role to play for both private sector and entities, think tanks and so on, that can help us understand what this plant can do. I mean, we know quite a bit as far as its ability to unlock some of the benefits of the endocannabinoid system. I think as we go through this process of deregulation or decriminalization, obviously legalization and so on, and particularly in the US, where a lot of states are still where they were many years ago, there is hope that as we, I go back to the private sector and I go back to this idea of, you know, we have a responsibility as private sector entities, and that I take that on myself, given that I'm involved in a few projects as partner and brand builder. We have a responsibility to do part of the job, you know, in bringing about an understanding of what different product value propositions can do, as opposed to this idea of, you know, the race to higher levels of THC, you know, which is very much a recreational play. There's so much there with terpenes. There's so much there, you know, with the combination of obviously CBD and THC ratios. There's so much there with the way in which, you know, dosage can actually be positioned in order to get to that wellness value prop. And I think, you know, will government be the one driving that sort of, if you will, a normalization or that level of mainstream consumption? I doubt it. I think it's on us, you know, as private sector, to introduce enough product and enough opportunity for people who would never touch these substances, at least in the cannabis world, to start tapping into them. And some are. I mean, there's been quite a bit of product innovation, but nowhere near as much as there should be. So I keep going back to the private sector's responsibility and not just putting the onus on government.
Jonathan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit about regulation, in the sense that I think the history of coffee in a couple of points shows you the problems of regulation, in terms of that. First of all, as I said, you know, when we go right back to when we go right back to sort of the Ottoman Empire or whatever, what we notice is the inability to actually suppress coffee houses because they're popular. And ultimately all you do is, you know, you can't at a certain point take things back. And I was quite thinking, when Craig was talking about prohibition, that one of the features, particularly for kind of promoting coffee in the late 19th, early 20th century, was as the counterpoint to alcohol. So as part of that sort of a teetotal type movement, for example, in Britain, the temperance movement opened a large number of what they called coffee taverns, about 1,000 coffee taverns. And these places really achieved very little. I mean, they didn't stop people going to pubs, but they also weren't that effective as businesses. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because actually, you know, consumption has to be enjoyable. People do not want to consume substances in a regulated manner. There's, you know, I was intrigued by Craig's regulations on beer consumption. That was news to me. But what I guess I'm driving at here is that actually, by and large, hard regulation tends to do the opposite. It's a bit like banning your teenager child from doing something, isn't it? If you want to make it exciting for them, that's the easiest way to do it. So I would agree with Jeronimo that actually there are different, there are better ways, as it were, of promoting responsibility than that.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple more comments, so I'd like to move on. Rick Pale has one, and he sent actually a question on email earlier, so I'm thinking maybe this is his question and he'd like to ask it. Rick, do you want to unmute yourself and then you can ask your question?
Sure. The discussion, first of all, my background, I spent the latter half of my experience as a historian of advertising working on tobacco, and I had access to lots and lots of corporate documents because I was involved in consulting with lawyers in the various trials and litigations. So I was deeply steeped in the inside information as well as the issues. The discussion that we've just had, I think, raises an important distinction. You know, some of the discussion is essentially the battle for men's minds within corridors of power. That is public policy debates, thought leaders and their attitudes, official stances, perhaps by churches and the like. I think it's important to make a distinction between, you know, attitudes toward these products, or drugs, if you will, in those domains, that is, those domains of officialdom, versus the domain of the street. I think the big issue in tobacco is while there continued to be hostile attitudes in the domains of officialdom, on the street, tobacco became very popular. Two dramatic moves. One, advertising. That, of course, did a lot to legitimize the product and give it what the industry calls friendly familiarity by being omnipresent in the culture. And also some public relations activities. In World War I, for example, there was a deft move when General Pershing was convinced by lobbyists to make cigarettes part of the rations for all the soldiers. So thousands and thousands of soldiers returned to America smoking cigarettes, and of course they were the heroes, so successive generations emulated them. Anyway, my main point is that the making a distinction between what's going on within the halls of power or officialdom and what's going on the street, I think is helpful, and it's sometimes misleading to conflate the two.
Thanks, Rick. Does anyone want to comment on that? No, they all agree. I agree with you too. Go ahead.
I think it's absolutely true, and I think the questioner Rick was speaking, I was thinking back to the silence of the drinkers over the generations in which prohibitionists were so active. They rarely came into the public sphere and defended themselves. There was a royal commission in the 1890s that met for a great deal of time gathered evidence across the country. There's great volumes on the shelves of libraries. You can go and look at the testimony. Not a single person comes forward and said, I think drinking booze is just wonderful. And yet there are literally hundreds of thousands of people at that moment across the country enjoying it. And it is absolutely true that you can have a public policy debate that is far from what popular attitudes are to these substances.
Jonathan or Jeronimo, anything to add?
No, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I was going to go ahead simply by saying I completely agreed with Rick. I thought his point is absolutely right. So I'm afraid I'm now going to pass it to Jeronimo for some insightful comments.
Oh no, I was going to say the same thing. I definitely agree with the comments. Just another thought that entered my mind as I was listening to Jonathan's, to Rick's comments, was also around the idea of stigma. Like, we really cannot undermine, and this divide between public policy debates and what's happening behind the scenes, or what people are doing, and the hypocrisy that can, sort of be involved in some of these storylines, if you will, narratives. Stigma is a very powerful force of that we all have seen in the history of these substances, and that we see it in the history of tobacco as well, and that's something we haven't necessarily dived into too much, and we're probably out of time to do so today, but it is a very powerful piece, and that's why I linked it back to advertising and the role of brand builders and communicators and so on. Because then we can have a whole conversation around that, and what the ad world has done for alcohol, for tobacco, for coffee, and for cannabis, for good or bad, in order to create or dismantle stigma.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeronimo. And I'm actually going to go back to Patrice's question a little bit, because they did ask for me to give my opinion as well. And I think that my opinion dovetails very nicely with what you just said, Jeronimo. And one of the reasons we don't have advertising and really very much branding here in Canada in the cannabis space is because of regulations. And, we certainly understand that the regulations are there to protect the public and to protect our youth and to make sure that the public health is protected. But what ends up happening is that your conversation becomes very limited, and we have difficulty talking about all of the wellness benefits and the benefits to society that can be provided through the regulation of a substance. So I think for me, one of the lessons that's really important to take from the past into the future, and especially when we're talking about things like regulating psychedelics and new substances, is to make sure that there is an eye on equity and on diversity and on inclusion in these industries, because as we saw, you know, with especially with coffee and with alcohol, the people who were enforcing these regulations were the same ones who were breaking them. So they weren't really going to arrest anyone. You know, tens of thousands of people were not being arrested for alcohol, or weren't being arrested for being in coffee shops, because those in charge were also engaging in these activities. So I think it's just important to maintain an awareness as we move forward that there are many sides and many perspectives to these issues, and that it's important to make sure that people who have been already using these substances aren't further criminalized or stigmatized as they are legalized in our society. So that brings us to the end of our time. It is 3 o'clock today. I would like to give a huge thank you so much to all of our panelists, Jonathan, Craig, and Jeronimo. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience for popping on here today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to National Bank for being our sponsor. We do have a couple upcoming programs. Let's see, on December 10th at 2 p.m., we are hosting the historical anniversaries of the Hudson's Bay Company and the province of Manitoba. It's the 350th anniversary of the Hudson's Bay Company, oldest company in Canada. Very exciting. So please consider joining up for that event as well. And if you are not already a member of the Canadian Business History Association, I would also encourage you to consider joining up for that as well. You do get a free subscription to Canada's History magazine, the ability to apply for a number of grants and scholarships that we have, as well as access to our monthly newsletter that's full of important and interesting information that's relevant to our members. So thank you so much for everyone joining us here today. We hope to see you at our next panel. And thanks, everyone. Have a great day.